anyone paying attention shouldn't be surprised at what Trump is doing. I mean, he doesn't care about the environment. He doesn't believe in climate change. He has associated himself with people of the same ilk. What the public would be surprised at is how little the national environmental community is doing and has done for decades now.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance. We're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we have Denise Boggs. Denise is Director of Conservation Congress and has been a national forest activist for 40 years. Welcome to the Green Root podcast, Denise.
Thanks, Josh.
Well, I'm really happy to have you here. You have been at this work for longer than I have, well, twice as long as I have, and I have been inspired by your tenacity. And I wanted to have you on to talk about what's going on public lands right now. There's a lot happening. So I guess the way I'd like to start it off is we're seeing a lot of the protections on public lands get eroded. Many of us have believed for some time that even that status quo is not acceptable, that those protections have been pretty weak. But right now, the Trump administration, per usual, has got its foot on the gas, and it's executing these orders, these rollbacks, roadless rule, all sorts of fake emergency logging, et cetera, frankly. So clearly this is all on Trump, right?
Not exactly. I think anyone paying attention shouldn't be surprised at what Trump is doing. I mean, he doesn't care about the environment. He doesn't believe in climate change. He has associated himself with people of the same ilk. So that's really no surprise. I think what the public would be surprised at is how little the national environmental community is doing and has done for decades now. Before this podcast, I took a quick look at GuideStar, which is a web platform that shows all the nonprofits that want to register with them so people can have information on donor giving and things like that. So it's all verifiable. If someone doesn't believe what I say, they can go to GuideStar and check it out themselves. The Nature Conservancy is the largest environmental organization in the country, and some of us call them the Nature Conspiracy because they're involved in logging and grazing and things on public and private lands that are very detrimental to the environment. And I have a friend who actually compared some grazing on public lands, which most people know is just horribly degraded lands. It's very harmful. With Nature Conservancy lands that are grazed, and TNC's lands were in worse shape than the public lands. That's one clue about the Nature Conservancy and their apparent non-commitment to environmental protection. Their gross annual budget is $4 trillion. That's with a T. And their assets are $9.5 trillion. So if we just look at that organization alone, why do we have so much deforestation, overgrazing, water pollution, air pollution, ocean pollution? I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. The environment is probably in some of the worst shape it's ever been in. since we passed all these environmental laws back in the 1970s. Everything is being weakened. What are they doing about it besides collecting money? Um, you can buy a seat on their advisory board. You can buy a seat on their board. And if you look at their board, they have people involved in timber, livestock, coal mining, um, and their 501c3 has been threatened numerous times, and somehow they always manage to keep it. And I don't really understand that, because they don't operate like a nonprofit. They operate like a for-profit. And quite frankly, they're not doing environmental protection. They're doing environmental destruction, in my opinion. And that's just one organization. I won't go through all the individual numbers, but I looked at Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society, the Environmental Defense Fund, National Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, and NRDC. Combined, those organizations have annual budgets of $1.6 trillion. Now, when you combine that with the Nature Conservancy, that's $5.6 trillion. How could we possibly be in the situation that we're in? It's unfathomable. And I really wish the public would wake up and pay attention to these groups, because you have all kinds of people writing their checks for $25 or $50 or $1,000 and sending them to these organizations in Washington, D.C., thinking that they're doing something good. And these individuals, their intentions are good, but these groups are not good, and they're not doing their job. And frankly, they get in the way of people like me who, according to GuideStar, I have a budget of $95,000 a year. It's actually less than that. It's gone down over the last few years since the pandemic. I think it's about 80,000 this year. And, I'm out in the field talking to Forest Service people about a damaging timber sale that's going to impact northern spotted owls, which is a threatened species that should be listed as endangered, and the Fish and Wildlife Service agrees with that. Um, and complaining about what they're doing, and then the Nature Conservancy comes along, and not only do they sign off on what the Forest Service is doing, they say, oh, you could log more over here. I mean, who are they representing? They're representing the timber industry. And if you go to one of their meetings, the people that work for Nature Conservancy and put on these meetings with the Forest Service, they dress like forest rangers, everything from the little green suits to the boots. And I mean, it's just absurd what they're doing. And, if we want to talk about wilderness, has anyone heard of any wilderness designation anywhere by the Wilderness Society? I mean, they have the name wilderness in their title. I don't think they have gotten any wilderness designated in at least 20 years that I'm aware of. Um, National Audubon, birds have been in the news a lot lately. We've about 70% reduction in migratory birds. Songbirds in particular are doing very, very poorly. And, they have $193 million a year to work with. Why are birds declining so much? Um, and I'm going to quit harping on these groups, but my point is they're not doing their job. And there are small organizations like mine, like the Alliance for the Wild Rockies, like Swan View Coalition. I have to give a shout out to Friends of the Wild Swan in Big Fork, Montana. Their budget is $26,000 a year. I mean, most people make more money than that. And Arlene Montgomery is a fantastic activist. She files lawsuits and she wins them. Alliance for the Wild Rockies is very prolific in litigation, and they win probably 90% of their lawsuits. Same with Swan View Coalition that works to protect grizzly bears, primarily up in the Flathead. And these little groups work on just a dime budget, and they accomplish more work than all these other groups put together. And I think people need to ask themselves why. Are these groups in DC corporate groups, or are they grassroots nonprofit groups? And I would argue they're corporate groups. And they get all this money to do nothing. It's basically being paid to do little to nothing to actually protect the environment. And all the small grassroots groups are marginalized, they're radical, they're strident. That's what we're called: radical, strident, extremist, and nothing could be further from the truth. We're actually on the ground doing the work, trying to protect forest, habitat, and wildlife. I'm really proud of the work that we do and what the other grassroots organizations do. And I just wish the public had a better idea of how this actually works on the ground and who's doing what.
Well, I think that's an excellent and devastating summary of the reality of what the mainstream environmental movement has become, what many call the big greens. And
Mhm.
actually, I was not aware of those vast sums. Of course, I knew they had a lot of money, but that's pretty mind-boggling. And we've done a whole episode on the Nature Conservancy before,
Mhm.
so that's our listeners are aware of the fact that, well, I'm not even sure I'd classify them as an environmental group, but they're certainly seen as one. But yes, I think your point of this amount of money for this amount of failure, and then
Yeah.
meanwhile the entities who are doing the grassroots work on the ground, who are drawing lines in the sand saying you come this far and no further, they get a pittance. So what, I guess my question is, why is that? I'm not saying the world is just unjust. Okay. But why is there such a disparity, would you say? Do you have any ideas?
I do. I think that these groups in Washington, D.C. have largely been taken over by their corporate owners. I think that's part of the problem. There are also foundations that, like the Pew Foundation, for example, um, they get their money from corporate profits, and they tend to donate to organizations that they can control. And they'll say, oh, well, we'll give you $50,000, but you can do this and you can't do that. I don't agree with that, and I, our organization has been offered money by certain foundations with that type of idea. And I say, absolutely no. If you want to give us money, you believe in what we do, we'll use the money wisely to protect habitat and wildlife. But if you're going to tell me what I can and can't do, I don't want your money. That's real grassroots. That's not allowing ourselves to be bought. It's not allowing our programs to be driven by people who are not experienced in forest issues and wildlife and habitat. Um, and it's a big problem because corporations were smart. They knew how to take over these groups, give them money, and tell them what they can't do. And I think that's the primary reason why these organizations are the way they are.
Yeah, I think there's a direct line there between corporate foundations and Big Green, no question. I will just add as a caveat, there are some smaller family or grassroots foundations that do provide grants without strings attached. They're very hands off and generous. Eco Integrity
Absolutely.
Alliance does appreciate those entities. But yeah, there's other foundation I say, I'm like, all right, I'm not even going to bother to apply to them, first of all, because their
Mhm.
parameters are not really strong enough. And knowing the fingers that would be in our pies, so to speak, stayed away from them. But yeah, in terms of the foundations that are doing legitimate work and funding grassroots groups, unfortunately, they are dwarfed by the massive giants that are just pumping out corporate money. And yeah, I would say that's one of the biggest scandals that people don't realize about in the environmental movement. It's not, look at this crappy law that's passed, look at this administration that's doing this. It's just, why has this been unraveling? Why with, you can argue against this, I guess, but I feel like many progressive causes have gained more traction, at least over the years. Of course, there's setbacks with administrations, but just in the general knowledge, I think a lot of that at least has made some progress. It seems to me that environmental stuff has only just been going down and down the drain.
Mhm.
More and more money is existing. Frankly, more and more public awareness of things like climate change. So, in my mind, that can be the only reason for it. It's just that the money is going towards, basically, I don't want to say fake environmentalism. People call that, instead of grassroots, they call it astroturf. But something is going on. And I guess the question would be how to address that. Would you have any insights?
Well, I want to back up for just a minute and agree with you about there are some good smaller foundations that are great at funding grassroots people, and they trust us to do the work, and they don't put constraints on what we do. And I, of all people, am appreciative of that because we get some of those grants. As far as what to do, I think public education um, is paramount, and you know, I don't know how to beat back people with a combined budget of $9 trillion. Do you take out billboards in every state saying the Nature Conservancy is a fraud? I mean, I don't know how that would work. um, we live in a capitalistic country where money talks and money drives everything. So it really is very, very difficult um, to fight that. The other thing is, I think maybe the IRS should have different regulations for some of these groups. You know, real environmental groups, I think, are grassroots groups, people that work on the ground and talk to people in communities. And um, they don't have offices that cost over $1 million and staff making over $1 million, and um, or tier them somehow, these nonprofit groups. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but it's something that has bothered me for a very long time because I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I really have seen many of these groups go downhill, like the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society. They weren't as bad as they are now. They've just been on this downhill slide for a long time, and the more money they get, the more useless they become. So I don't know, keep doing podcasts, Josh, and informing people, don't send these groups your money. Um, they don't need it anyway. With most of their money is corporate money, and they don't need individual donations.
I would go further and say your money is at best wasted with all the overhead and
Mhm.
administrative stuff. At worst, it's just going towards harmful things. So for sure, find local grassroots groups, make sure they have a decent reputation amongst people who you know are actually legitimate, maybe lifelong environmentalists, right? So people do want to help and they say, I've heard of that group. They therefore have
Mhm.
credibility. That makes a lot of sense. But yeah, you got to look a little bit harder. And I guess it's also worth saying, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. There are some, I would say that there are some good people inside these larger environmental groups. I just think that their hands get tied. And then at a certain point in time, they either just can't do the right thing or they start believing things because it's a self-protection mechanism. You can't
Mhm.
really be a person who goes to work every day and saying, "Here I go harming the environment." Like you
Right.
can't live like that psychologically. So, yeah,
They
it's
drink the
unfortunate.
Kool-Aid.
They do,
Well,
which it's their responsibility that they've made that choice. But I don't think personally it's people are like they join the Sierra Club to work for them. And they're like, cool, now I get to kill all the forest. Like that's of course
right.
not what they're. And I'm not saying you're saying that.
Right. Well, and as far as saying they don't need your individual donation, I can give you an example, and I'm sure many people have had this happen. You get solicitations in the mail, like from National Wildlife Federation, I think was the last one I got. And, send them $10 and we'll send you a backpack and a stuffed animal and all these swag that they have that costs more than $10. And that tells me they don't need my $10. They just want to, add another tick to their membership and claim they have a large membership. And I think that's something that should get people's attention instead of, oh boy, I can get a backpack for $10. Think about it a little bit more about what they're doing with your name.
Right. That's right. No, excellent points. And yeah, I feel like ultimately the word needs to get out more about these environmental groups. But let's just say in a perfect world, we can press that button and then they just disappear. Then we need to fill the vacuum. So that's why I see more and more building up the grassroots. There's lots of groups are doing excellent work, uniting more. That's what we're attempting to make an effort at in terms of what's going on with Eco Integrity Alliance. There's already so many good folks doing so much good work. What if a uniting of that could operate kind of as an alternative to Sierra Club because people want to know what else to help. So that's the long-term plan. But here's the problem most people don't realize, I mean, most people don't know national forests are even being logged. Whose fault is that, right? That I
Right.
would say the big green. Most people aren't aware of a lot of environmental issues. Here in Colorado, we have the largest logging project, from what I know, in Colorado history, definitely of the century, 116,000 acres. It's in
Mhm.
Colorado roadless areas, endangered species. Of course, it's wildfire pretense logging,
Right.
whatever it ties into this national fake emergency that Trump expanded to 112 million acres that was enacted under the Biden administration. We've gotten zero media coverage. And I've
Mhm.
worked for the media. That's kind of my expertise is engaging with the media. They don't want to cover it. We have a handful of medium-sized groups that are doing some cool work here in Colorado that are sort of engaging on it. So I'm appreciative of them. But the big greens have been dead silent. And even on
Mhm.
Fix Our Forests, which a lot of people we call FR Forests, we've done a whole
Yeah.
episode on that with Rocky Smith, who is here
Mhm.
in Colorado. And behind the scenes, we've gone to meetings with our elected officials, and the big greens are there and they don't really do much pushback. I've seen them in action. It's actually quite appalling. And so I always have to be the bad cop in the room. And then secretly behind the scenes, other people contact me. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm like, well, why
Right.
didn't you bring it up? Like,
Exactly.
why do I, with no influence or voice and who have been marginalized as a radical because I believe in public lands protection, have to say these things that are ignored? So that's what's going on. So I guess my question for you, my leading question would be, does media need to play more of a role in this expose of what's going on in the mainstream environmental movement?
Absolutely. But the caveat would be I would be worried about how they would approach it. You know, when is the last time you read an article about the Sierra Club in the newspaper? I mean, first of all, for groups that have $9 trillion collectively, we don't see a whole lot of media about these groups. And when we do, it's generally positive. And it's something else I don't understand. I mean, we all know journalism has changed a lot, and according to Trump, it's all fake news. And while I wouldn't go that far, I would say that in large part, large media is not doing their job. They're not asking the questions, the hard questions. They're not printing information that people need to know. And in many cases, they're kowtowing to Trump. Everyone is afraid of Trump. I really don't understand that with what we're seeing going on with lawyers and politicians and journalists bending over backwards to appease this buffoon who knows nothing about nothing. I mean, it just boggles my mind. So I would love it if we had more mainstream media covering the environment and going to the grassroots for that coverage to find out what's going on. And tied in with that is, the grassroots really needs a presence in Washington, D.C. to combat the big greens and all their lobbyists who are telling congressional people, God knows what. Um, the only lobbyists I know of representing the grassroots is the John Muir Project in California, and they have a couple of people who do a great job. But you have two people up against thousands of people working for these big green organizations, and we need a lot more of that. And if there was some kind of coalition that real grassroots groups could join, knowing that they had real grassroots lobbyists to inform people, I think that would be really beneficial. But that takes money. And that's always the issue, is the grassroots don't have the money to have some fancy real estate in Washington, D.C. and, pay for 1,000 lobbyists. We just don't have it, and the big greens know it, and they have us over a barrel in that regard. And it's really unfortunate because there's either a lack of information or there's misinformation. And you brought this up with the logging to prevent wildfire. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles that state logging to prevent wildfire does not work. And the Forest Service generally does these logging projects in the backcountry that's far away from communities. And I would argue we need zoning so people can quit building in these wildland urban interface areas. And if they insist on having a home there and it burns down, they should not be bailed out by the government for it, and they should have their own insurance that will pay for it. And insurance companies are catching on now and saying, we're not going to insure you. But then the government comes and bails them out, and all these people just rebuild in the same area. There are some communities where houses have burned down 3 and 4 times. I mean, at a certain point, you have to ask, how stupid are you? Why do you keep building in a place that you know is going to burn? But from a journalistic standpoint, I have read very few articles that talk about this logging to prevent wildfire. It doesn't work. And when you read that, it's simply not true. They're not doing their homework. The journalists aren't doing their homework.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously I have a lot to say about this, and I have said it a lot on the
Mm-hmm.
podcast, but to just very quickly run through it, yeah, I think a lot of media, well, they either don't have the time to look into stuff because their models are failing, they don't have the knowledge and expertise to be able to understand two sides of a story. I've literally had a journalist say, listen, I understand that there's these studies that show this and studies that show the opposite, so I just decided not to do a story at all. And it's like, well, that's not cool. And then here's the thing, and I want to tee this up as well, because we don't want to just blame the Republicans for everything, although that would be pretty
Oh, no.
easy and pretty
Mhm.
accurate. Not saying it isn't Trump's fault, not saying that these folks are not consistently horrible on environmental issues. But what I'm noticing in a place like Colorado, which is a pretty darn blue state, maybe outside of the rural areas, is they're not afraid of Trump at all. They're happy to criticize Trump. The problem with Colorado is that all the logging is being promoted by the Democrats. And I do
Mhm.
share this one Trump perspective. I think a lot of media is partisan. There's obviously Republican
Mhm.
leading media, and there is a lot of Democrat leading media, and there's a lot of weird other ideologies and special interests in there. But here in Colorado, frankly, I wish we had a Republican entities that were pushing all the logging, because then I think we would get a lot more pushback from our environmental groups and our media. So, what do you feel about my conspiracy theory that a lot of poor media coverage on environmental issues, on unwillingness to call out the greens, et cetera, the big greens, is because they sort of are beholden to Democratic Party talking points? What do you think about that?
I don't think it's a conspiracy, Josh. I think you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought it up because the Democrats have taken advantage of people who care about the environment forever, longer than I've been alive. And they look at it like, well, what are you going to do? Vote for the Republicans? Well, at least the Republicans are honest that they don't give a damn about the environment. The Democrats are totally dishonest on this issue, and they tell people they care about the environment when they don't. That makes them liars. Some of the very worst people on the environment, on forest issues that I care about, are Democrats. Wyden in Oregon, he's horrible. Um, and you can go through and look at the voting record and see, uh, how many Democrats support logging to prevent wildfire, how many Democrats support um, eviscerating the Endangered Species Act, weakening the Endangered Species Act. Um, it was a Democrat, John Tester, who lost his last election to a Trump Republican, that put a rider on a bill to delist gray wolves, which are, as you know, because wolves are now in Colorado, they're better protected there than they are in Montana, Washington, Idaho. Um, where they're being killed left and right, horrible ways, trapping and not just shooting and trapping, but snaring and using night vision goggles and snares and just despicable ways that cause immense suffering to these beautiful animals. Democrats are not a friend of the environment. They love to talk about climate change, but what are they doing about it? Absolutely nothing. It's we just have a very broken system, and you know i I think we should have term limits. I think um, people should be vetted better. I look at someone like Nancy Pelosi. She's what, 81, and she's going to run for reelection again. We need age limits. I think the founding fathers looked at people going to Washington for a shorter period of time to represent the people in their state or communities, and then they go home and they get a real job. And instead, we have people who stay there forever. It's a career. They're there for 50 years, 60 years. Um, Dianne Feinstein, left in a wheelchair with dementia and died shortly after she left office. And she was supposed to be this great Democrat on everything. And I would argue she was terrible on the environment. I honestly, Raul Gravalia, I hope I said his name right. I always mispronounce it. From Arizona, was one of the better Democrats. He passed away, and his daughter is seeking his seat now. I don't like all this family You know, it's like, it's more like a monarchy where you have these family names and they just keep staying in office forever. Um, but
Yeah, I
anyway,
can't disagree.
I'm on a
No,
tangent.
no, but that's the deeper change that's needed. I think you're absolutely accurate. There's so many different angles, but to sort of tie this in a bow to finish things up here, in terms of a public lands movement, which in many ways it doesn't feel like there has been one for a while. Again, smaller groups, grassroots groups doing great work, but in terms of compared to a climate movement, now lately with what's been in the news, the attempts to sell off public lands, which I don't really think have a lot of likelihood anyway, but all of the removal of protections, public lands are kind of becoming more of a thing to your average person. So, do you think what might be needed is that those of us who are doing the grassroots work on public lands, that we make it clear that we have very strong positions, that now is the time to have stronger proactive positions rather than retreating and retreating and retreating? Because let's just say that the idea of like, well, playing just like stepping back and just being prudent, well, we've tried that for decades, and how's that going for us? So, what do you think about that idea of a proactive, stronger, maybe even aggressive public lands movement to inspire the public around something to rally around and to actually get some wins going again? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a great idea if you could, um, find the grassroots people to get involved. As you know, grassroots activists are kind of like herding feral cats, and we're distrustful of large movements because we've been screwed over so many times by the big greens who tend to lead these movements, and then we become a part of them and they sell us out. Um, I'll give you an example. When the uh, Trump administration said they were going to roll back the roadless rule, the very first thing I got was a solicitation from the Wilderness Society. Where have they been on logging incursions into roadless lands? I'm not aware of them doing anything in roadless areas or working to turn, all IRAs are potential wilderness areas. Why haven't they pushed for IRAs to become designated wilderness? And then they wouldn't be impacted by this. But it's all about the money. So we can't trust the big greens to lead a campaign like that. Um, I think it would require the grassroots groups working on public lands to somehow coalesce. That takes money, it takes time, it takes organization. Maybe some of the good foundations could, you know, provide an opportunity for that to happen. I don't know. It's a tough call. I also think maybe, and I'm sure there are people who would disagree with this, but some of the people that were most outspoken about selling off public lands were like the Backcountry Horsemen Association. And a lot of these people are hunters and fishermen, and there are plenty of grassroots groups who don't like hunting, and I actually don't like hunting. Um, but I don't know, maybe it's working with some people where we have agreement, and but being bold and disagreeing with them. Like, I will never support hunting wolves as long as I live. And any organization that does, I am going to be opposed to that part of their project. But I would just hope that the American people in general would wake up and realize that they own public lands. I used to give workshops on filing Forest Service appeals, which are now known as objections. And I would ask people, how many people own land, and no hands would go up, and I'd say, well, did you know you own 192 acres of Forest Service lands? These lands are owned by all of us, and we all have a voice in how they are managed, and the Forest Service hates that fact. They don't want people to know that. And the collaboratives, which is a whole nother issue that you've probably done a podcast on, they want to bring this down to the local level. And in rural areas, that's often loggers and ranchers, and they want them to have all the say. Well, you live in Colorado, and as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the law is concerned, you have as much right to speak out on public lands in California or Massachusetts or Vermont, or you name it. These are your lands. So if Americans care about the heritage of national forests and wildlife and their habitat, and it's important to note that most wildlife are completely dependent on public lands for their existence. Um, in the West, there's a lot of private land where you have wildlife, but if the property owners wanted to do something about that, they could. So it's imperative, if we're going to have wildlife, that we have protected public lands. So I just encourage people to speak out and get involved. And so many of us who've been doing this work, we have gray hair, white hair, no hair. We need young people to get involved in these issues and to sincerely care and get involved, or we're going to lose it.
That's all very true, very inspiring, and very sobering. So I appreciate everything you've been bringing to the table over the decades, all the great work that you're doing. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast and giving your perspective to folks, which I'm sure people will heed very carefully. And yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is there a way that people can find out more about your work or can support you or reach out to you, or what do you think?
Well, we have a website like most small groups, and it's just conservationcongress.org.
I will link that in the description. And yeah, Denise, thanks again for coming on the Green Root podcast and for everything.
Yeah, thanks for asking me, Josh.